of the Radio Free Radio Show. I'm your host, Jeff Taylor. Today we're going to be talking about the G20 Summit in Toronto, and specifically about the events surrounding that in terms of protesters, demonstration, and the police response. I have with me today two independent journalists, Amy Miller, who has worked for a number of different organizations, including Wide Open Exposure and the Free Speech Radio News, and Jesse Freeston, who is from the Real News Network. Guys, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Amy is also a tremendous filmmaker and has a really great documentary out called Myths for Profit, all about Canadian foreign policy that people should check out.
Great. And let's, start out by just talking a bit about what the G20 is and what that was all about before we get into the demonstration aspect of it. You'll all probably also heard of, listeners have probably also heard of the G8. It's basically along the same lines, and in fact, there was a G8 meeting leading up to the G20 meeting, which took place, the G20 meeting that is, took place over the June 26th and 27th weekend. And the G20 is basically the heads of the major governments, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, United Kingdom, the United States, European Commission, and the European Council. And the main topic was the economic situation around the world and basically issues, not just economic issues, but political issues affecting these countries. And guys, if there's anything you want to add to that, jump in. I mean, that's basically the crux of it. Obviously, there's a lot more that you can go into in depth of that, but that's essentially what the G20 is about, or the summit was about. Am I correct on that? Anything you guys would like to add on that?
Go ahead, Amy.
Well, I mean, I think you did a good summary of the fact that it's an international institution that brings together essentially the states that are in a position to influence and dominate the economic order of the whole world, right? And we had a situation where only 10 years ago it was a small elite, and now the club's grown to include 20 nation states. But these are essentially the players that are having economic dominance over the whole world and dictating the economic policies for everyone around the world.
And one thing I would add to that really went unnoticed early on in the economic crisis was that the United Nations General Assembly tried to have, if you want to talk about the nation-state level, they tried to have a G192 led by, at the time, the President of the General Assembly, Miguel de Escoto from Nicaragua, saying that if this is really a global economic crisis, then really we should have all the world's at least state-level representation at the table if that's the level that they're supposed to be doing it at. And that campaign was really sunk by a lot of these G20 states using their influence over other countries to get them not to send head of state level people to that original meeting that was scheduled in June of 2009 by Miguel de Escoto. So we saw, countries like the U.S. and other countries in the G20, essentially saying that your aid and loan agreements are and using that sort of leverage to get other countries not to send their delegates to this meeting.
Right, basically sort of shutting them out in terms of an equal spot in the conversation, or at least that's one way of looking at it. And I guess let's move on, since I know you're both pressed for time. Let's move on to what I really want to get into more than anything else, the demonstrations and the protests and the police response. There were tens of thousands of protesters who took to the streets. A lot has been made in the media about the anarchist groups, or group, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it, which employed black bloc techniques. For those who don't know what black bloc techniques are, it's essentially when the group dresses up all in black, often carries flags. They're also black or sometimes red, I believe. Usually they're covering their faces, and they're taking part in basically property damage, breaking windows of storefronts, most often stores that are, like the Starbuckses of the world, not usually the mom and pops, but the bigger corporate stores, setting police cruisers on fire. And these things all happened in Toronto, but I think it's safe to say that was a small percentage of what happened. Is that a fair assessment, would you guys say? That this sort of small group within a larger group of more traditional protests that was not taking place, or not taking part in the vandalism?
Well, I think there's a nuance as well. I wouldn't use the word group to represent the Black Bloc. I mean, the Black Bloc model and tactic structure is made up of smaller affinity groups. It's not like it's a gang of people that meet regularly and that all know each other.
Right.
It's a tactic formation that people decide to take, and it's a variety. It's a tremendous grouping of small groups of people that come together and use that. But yes, in the larger context, we saw up to estimated 60,000 people come and take to the streets and speak out against the austerity measures that are being put in place, speaking out against the massive division of wealth that we have around the world, speaking out against the fact that we're seeing continuous carbon emissions spewed around the world and heat temperatures rising around the world and climate chaos without any actual moves towards reduction by the nation states, speaking out against infant mortality rates around the world that are on the rise, and speaking out against just ongoing neoliberal policies that are being put in place that affects us on our daily lives. Here in Canada, we're seeing our education systems being slashed. We're seeing pensioners who are unable to survive. We're seeing our hospitals shutting down, and we're seeing just every basic social welfare aspect that Canada's had for the last 50 years crumble and it'd be deteriorated by ongoing neoliberal policies that are set up and maintained by economic institutions, international institutions like the G8 and the G20. So we had a broad spectrum of people from across different walks of life who were coming out and speaking out, from union organizers and union members to not-for-profit and civil society organizations to people who aren't affiliated with any group but who are speaking out and frustrated the fact that these unaccountable institutions continue to take place and double speak they put in terms of saying they're for helping people while at the same time cutting services and putting policies in place that harm our basic existence.
And I would say those...
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add, without really commenting on the Black Bloc's property destruction tactics, but just to add that that's not the only tactic that people using the Black Bloc formation have done in the past. For example, in 2007 at Montebello, we saw Black Bloc more play the role of defending the peaceful protesters from being attacked by police officers. That's one thing that they did, and they've and actually helped in de-arresting a few people who the police were trying to take into their custody. So there's more complexity to sort of the history of the Black Bloc and things that they've done in the past. I think just to pick up on what Amy was saying is that there's an illusion here that by moving from the G8 to the G20 that this is somehow getting more democratic. When what's going on and what's being talked about in these conferences really aren't reflecting, as far as I can tell, and I haven't traveled to the majority of the G20 countries, but from the little bit of research that I've done in terms of what's going on domestically in each one of these countries, is that nothing that's really of interest or that people are pushing as their community level issues in any of these countries are actually making it to the G20 level. So, for example, when they passed this agreement to put in force these austerity measures to cut deficits, in none of these countries are people's call for those deficit cuts to come from taxing the rich or taxing these vast accumulated amounts of wealth that all these countries have. That call is never being heard and never being brought up at the G20. At the G20, deficit cuts mean cuts to programs like what we're seeing in Canada and these other countries. It doesn't mean taxing into these vast pools of wealth that all these countries have accumulated.
I think that's a good point. And I think what's interesting is that basically, I mean, essentially, almost over actually $1 billion was spent. Not all of it on security, but most of it on security, prepping for the G20. And really most of the justification for this that was given, they pointed to anticipation of these black bloc tactics, saying that, they had to protect against, what they were essentially calling a violent group or potentially violent acts. But then when you look at footage, and by the way, for those who are listening who don't already know this, if you just go online, there's tons and tons and tons of footage on YouTube and various other video sharing sites, just showing all kinds of protests from black bloc tactics to non-black bloc tactics. But what was interesting from what I saw, now obviously I can't say that I was there, but from the videos that I saw, when these black bloc tactics were happening, I didn't see police intervening. I did see in one video that there were police there, but they were just basically standing there and videotaping. When you see police intervening, making arrests, in some cases being violent against the protesters, those are against protesters who are not dressed in black, are not involved in property damage, and who are peacefully assembling, or in some cases weren't even protesting. There was one case I heard about, actually, Jesse, from your organization, the Real News Network, where there's reportedly a man who was looking for his daughter and was basically attacked by a police officer. So kind of strange that they were saying that all of this security, all this ramping up was for black bloc tactics or to defend against them, but really that didn't seem to be the case in the end. Is that kind of the impression that you guys got as well?
Well, I just want to address something. First of all, we've seen just right off the top. Sorry?
Go ahead.
Okay. I just want to quickly touch on this, is that there's been a tendency to say, there's even people who weren't even protesting, as if there's some sort of different levels of legality going on here, and that somehow protesting is like quasi-legal, and that, and I think that that's something we should be careful about saying, is that, even innocent bystanders were caught up in these mass arrests or were beaten in this situation. If we're led to believe that we're in a society that embraces and accepts and encourages participation, then those rights should be applied equally across the board to people who are quote-unquote bystanders and people who are outside expressing, a political opinion. And so, I just wanted to address that point.
Good point. Yeah.
I wanted to add to the fact that, we have to put this in the broader context that between Friday night and Saturday morning, we had some of the very high-profile, very well-respected community organizers from across Ontario and Quebec who were rounded up in house raids, who were rounded up on the streets, and who are now on huge trumped-up conspiracy charges. These are political prisoners. There's 17 right now who were saying they were, so-called in charge of organizing all of this rampage and chaos, as the mainstream media is liking to portray it. This is absolutely disgusting and has to be acknowledged. This political prosecution, this is a form of neo-McCarthyism that we're seeing happening, where all of a sudden, if you're an above-ground organizer, community organizer, rooted in movement, social justice work, then you're up for potentially being targeted and arrested for conspiracy. And that is absurd, and that goes against all of our fundamental rights. We're talking about people who are migrant organizers, people who have a long history of social justice organizing, and what it's saying is that if you're critical about capitalism, if you're critical of the state, and watch out, you're going to get trumped up charges on you and thrown in jail. These people are still in jail, and that they're being saying they're orchestrating black bloc. So I think this larger context has to be acknowledged. Out of the 1,060 people that were arrested, there's under 25 that are still in jail, and the majority of them are these community organizers who are long-term, well-known, well-respected organizers from across Canada, who are being pinned for all of this so-called chaos and destruction of the city of Toronto. And I think this is the beginning of a trend that we're seeing here in Canada that follows in the footsteps of the Green Scare that happened in the state the last few years, and of course, repressive measures towards community organizers, grassroots organizers across the global south for years now. And so I think it's a huge alarm bell for basic civil rights advocates and people who are concerned that, wait a minute, if we are now being criminalized for being organizers in our community, doing teaching, doing popular education, trying to get people to come out and speak out against austerity measures, then wait a minute, what does that mean? To me, it's a new form of McCarthyism happening right here.
And one of the things, ideas that's been put out there in terms of criminalizing some of these people who organized a lot of these actions is that people who had organized, marches and things of this nature and participated in them should have taken action themselves to physically stop the Black Bloc from this property destruction. And I think, this is a particularly sick and twisted logic, that these people are out in the streets denouncing the violence that they say that the G20, or that they accuse G20 leaders and G20 supported institutions of, or affiliated institutions of imposing on their communities, and they're being told to not physically stop the G20 because that would be a crime, and that's causing for 20,000 police officers to be mobilized in Toronto and millions of dollars spent on fences and cameras and whatever. Yet at the same time that they're being told that to stop that violence that is directly affecting them, they're not allowed to take physical action to stop that. They're being asked to put their bodies on the line and take physical action to stop people from smashing windows of corporate franchises and banks that aren't even in their community. So I think it's crazy, and literally that is like some of the strongest things that people have against these 17 people who are on trial for massive conspiracy charges up to 10 years in prison.
Mm.
And right now, I think it's time for everyone that views themselves as part of the social justice movements in communities across Canada and the United States. This is when the only conversation should be, how do we free our comrades and our brothers and sisters? How do we get all of the thousands of charges that were placed on people in the last 2 weeks dropped? I think it's ridiculous that the conversation continuously is veered towards the Black Bloc and peaceful protests and so-called violent protesters. I think this is a divisive tactic by the state and the police, and the people are falling into it. And the only conversation we should be having is, how do we get our comrades who are long-term community organizers out of jail? How do we drop the charges for all of the people that receive charges?
I would add that I think I totally agree with Amy in terms of the importance of focusing on the people who are still detained right now. But I think there's also needs to be a focus put on the fact that what we saw here was an exercising or a trial run of how to impose a martial law, and it's something that's been happening over years. You guys saw it in New York, where you are there, Jeff, in 2004, and it's developing. It's becoming more sophisticated, more technological, and more effective. And so we also need to stand up at this point for the rights of the people who have since been released, so that this can't happen again. This can't be the new precedent that broken glass is sufficient reason enough to deny people their basic rights or dignity, and it doesn't matter whether or not you think those rights come from a piece of paper like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms or from your basic essential dignity as a human being. The fact that it can be just completely taken away from you for an undetermined period of time simply because some glass was broken is a terrifying precedent that reaches beyond the 17 people that Amy so eloquently defended just now.
Well, that brings up a good point. A lot of why they were, or the police, the justification they were using for forcing people to show identification or just, making arrests goes back to something I believe called the Public Works Protection Act, which I just found out about, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe was something that basically a kind of a long-forgotten act put in place in 1939 to deal with the potential for German agents to make assassinations or come up on public buildings and make attacks. And this is something that they then sort of tried to use as justification, saying it's still on the books in order to make arrests at the well, not only at the convention center, but specifically at the convention center, for really anyone who is just standing around or whatever they consider to be making an approach to the building. Do I have that right? Do you guys know about that?
Well, my understanding, and this isn't some dusty old law, that it is actually quite a current ongoing use of law, but that what it's normally used is when you're doing road work and you're going to have to open up some pipes, and so you're going to have to put some barriers around it, or when there's a new heating system being put in a public building or what have you, right?
So very logistical construction work, not...
Exactly.
Yeah, but the problem with the law is it's not explicit about that at all. The law is extremely broadly phrased so that it can be applied in any way. Actually, it actually gives authorities the power to, and as we saw, what happened here was it was secretively passed, that essentially the cabinet of the provincial government, which meets in secret, in camera, as cabinets do, can essentially pass a law that, and it applies to anything. It actually applies to anything that conducts electricity. So anything, anywhere within 5 meters, you can design or call something a public work, anything that transmits electricity, because that's done by the state in Ontario. And so this gives you essentially it is a legal framework to impose martial law in a city. Now, the important thing to note here is that law wasn't really actually in effect outside of the fence, and martial law still was imposed. So, a lot of the focus around this law, although I agree that it's a terrifying law to have on the books, given that its potential use is particularly terrifying. I mean, the most terrifying potential implication of that law was put in place without it. That people were being submitted to illegal searches, asking to show identification. I mean, everything about that law was in place without the law. So it's kind of a distraction, a little bit of a media circus, in my opinion, how that law's been treated.
Jeff, I wanted to jump in because I have to get back to work, but I wanted to thank you for inviting me, and I just wanted to comment that I think it's really important for your listeners to ask the question, are we moving closer to a world where we're having more rights and abilities to live in a world where all people are free and justice is found, or are we moving closer to a world where martial law is imposed, we're living in a police state, and where our basic needs are not being met? And I think with the G20 example in Toronto, where there's a facade that Canada is a bastion of civil rights and human rights, that myth is being quickly eroded for many people as they see that the world we're living in and the basic rights that many around the world do not have is quickly coming to Canada as well. And I do echo Jesse's thoughts that this was a test run for martial law and a quick movement that we could possibly see here in North America of the erosion of more of our basic rights on a daily basis. So I wanted to thank you for inviting me to speak on your show this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, and good luck with your work in the future.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. And Jesse, I wanted to talk to you a bit about your personal experience. There is video of your actually being assaulted by a police officer. I wanted to have you speak a little bit about that, if you could.
Yeah, sure. I've told the story quite a few times, and I think essentially the important aspects of the story is, first of all, that it happened before any of these black bloc tactics or the smashing and destruction of property took place, and it happened on the Friday during a march called Justice for Our Communities. Essentially, there was what turned out to be, it appears, a wrongful arrest, and a violent wrongful arrest, of a deaf man named Momotimi Azorbo. He essentially didn't respond to a police order, and something ensued. I wasn't there to witness it myself. I've only been taking secondhand statements about it, and seen some footage and some pictures, and it appears that's what happened. I don't know all the details, but he was detained and taken into a department store, and at which point the police surrounded the department store and created a cordon to stop people from entering, and people loudly protested for them to release him. That's when I showed up on the scene, at which point I guess police orders came in to clear the crowd out, and they violently started to do so, and I was right in the thick of it filming. And one thing that's interesting here is that in Canada, on our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I think there's a really well-worded piece of it that talks about freedom of the press. And freedom of the press doesn't lie with the journalist. Freedom of the press lies with every single individual in Canada. And so everybody in Canada has the right to a free press, which means that when I'm in there, in that situation, when other people are being attacked and I'm punched in the face and, thrown around a bit, and my mic stolen, that it's not that me as an individual, because I'm working with the media, because I'm working with a press organization, has more individual rights to not be punched in the face, to not be assaulted by police officers, to not be, wrongfully have my property confiscated and things of this nature. It's that when you do so, not only is it you're infringing my individual rights, but you're infringing the rights of my audience to know what's going on. And so I think that's another troubling aspect that's come out of this G20 thing, is we saw journalists systematically punished for trying to document what appeared to them to be abuse of power. And what's really been terrifying has been the mainstream Canadian media's willingness on many fronts to abandon that argument and in many cases seek to scapegoat the independent media and say that they're not real journalists, and that somehow imply that they deserved this treatment. And Amy was one of the people who was put into detention. I wasn't ever detained. There was at least more than 10 journalists with the Independent Media Center in Toronto who were put in the detention center at one point or another, many of which who were, brutally arrested while trying to film what appeared to them to be police misconduct. And, this is a particularly terrifying precedent. For example, take the detention center. There was never any journalist other than the ones who were detained who were allowed into the detention center while anybody was there. And now we've got this massive body of extremely serious accusations, things that went on in that detention center, and the public is left with accuser and accused and no third party involved. So you've got hundreds of very serious declarations and complaints and legal processes that are being started, and because there was no press allowed in there, it really compromises the case of the accusees. Unfortunately, given police history in Canada is not one of necessarily always telling the truth, just like anybody else. And at the same time, in the court of law and in the mainstream media in Canada, police's word is still given the benefit of the doubt. I'm not saying necessarily that everything that police say is a lie. I'm clearly not saying that, and I don't believe that to be true. But they, have reasons to bend the truth just like anybody else does, and there's no reason why they should be treated as inherently more trustworthy than the accusee. And that's what we're seeing, and contributing to that problem is the fact that no journalists were allowed in, and I should add that they weren't allowed in by the accused, by the police officers. And that's just one scenario where journalists were systematically denied access, and which leaves us in this horrible situation with just accused and accuser.
Right, and actually I have seen some people saying, there wouldn't have been arrests if people are not, this doesn't even seem to be bared out by the facts, but there wouldn't have been arrests if everyone just dispersed when they were told to disperse. But first of all, of course, there's the right to assembly, even, as long as you're doing it peacefully, and obviously the majority of people, I believe, were doing that. There's the right to assembly, the right to protest, and then perhaps, I won't say more importantly, but as importantly, the rights of journalists to be on hand so that everyone knows what happened. Because if you just disperse everyone and disperse the journalists while these arrests are taking place, then there really is no document, and there is no way for people to really know. And really, it should be a protection not only of the individuals, not only of the people being arrested, but also of the police officers. I mean, if they're not doing, this is a lot of times the argument that's made as well. If you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to fear. You'll be released, or you just in general have nothing to fear. Well, it should, I believe, work the other way as well. If the police officers aren't doing anything illegal or immoral, then they should have nothing to fear by being reported on it, by having press there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you usher them away, then, how is anyone to know in any event what happened in either direction?
Yeah, and worse yet, not just ushering them away, but brutally attacking them.
Right.
Or in the case of Amy's case, threatening them with gross sexual violence in order, and explicitly saying that that will hopefully result in them not being a journalist anymore. It's just sickening what happened, and essentially the declaration of impunity by the government through not putting in a public inquiry. Of course, there's internal processes where particular officers may face some sort of accountability, and maybe that'll happen, maybe it won't. But the bottom line is that there was serious training that went into this. All of this was very well orchestrated. There was, hundreds of cameras involved. The police forces of Canada were bragging beforehand about, the incredible technology that they had and how they could see all of downtown Toronto, and all of the detention center is covered in cameras. Everything was highly controlled, and without a public inquiry, which we're so far being denied, we don't really have a process in this country that has the jurisdiction, the subpoena power, the transparency to get to the bottom of these questions and really set a new precedent that this won't be allowed in the future. But one other point I wanted to add, is there's been a lot of talk about this Public Works Act, but really what this time around, at least, the more terrifying law in the books in terms of how it was used is called the Breach of the Queen's Peace. And this is a law that exists in all the Commonwealth countries and has existed, for hundreds of years. And it really, really stands in stark contradiction to the liberal ideas that developed after the fall of the British Empire, essentially. So under this law, the Queen's Council, which in Canada is the government, can essentially and is represented by the police in the streets, can essentially declare any person operating in a way that represents a breach of the Queen's peace, or that they have reason to believe that that person will, in some time in the future, begin to breach the Queen's peace. And the wording of this law is so incredibly vague that it essentially allows for anybody to be detained. And the really terrifying part about it is that it's not a criminal charge. It's not a charge of any kind. You're detained, you're arrested, you're read your rights, but you're never given a charge. You're never informed of why you were arrested, why you were detained, and you don't have to be. So it stands in contradiction to, the right to due process, the right to assembly, the right to freedom of expression. All these things are just cut at a moment, and it's a way to completely clean the streets of anybody who you consider you don't want out there anymore. And they can be held for up to 24 hours. And in some cases, this case, they were held for more than that. And of the almost 1,100 detainees in the prison, according to police numbers, more than 700 were held without charges under this breach of the Queen's peace. And, this is an archaic law, and really one that's, quite frightening that they have the power to do that.
Mm.
And in the most ironic sort of chronology of the week, maybe, is that the Queen herself actually arrived on Canadian or on the soil of this area. In many cases, she arrived in places that are actually unceded Indigenous lands, such as the capital of Ottawa, that's unceded Algonquin land. And there was a big celebration about the Queen is here. With only a couple days removed from when thousands of people were detained, searched, and taken off the streets in her name.
Right. And do we know at this point, and I'm guessing we don't really know, but what is it looking like in terms of the likelihood that there will be an inquiry?
There's a lot of public pressure for it from, a small number of very loud people, and mostly those who are directly affected by it. And, the really terrifying situation here is that, according to public opinion polls, almost 3/4 of Canadians think the police did a good job and are generally supportive. That said, the latest opinion poll that came out showed 47% want a public inquiry. They didn't go into specifically why each person wants a public inquiry, because there's a whole number of questions that need to be answered. From whose decision was it to put the G20 in downtown Toronto? Where did this more than $1 billion go. For example, the Toronto police force got $130 million, yet they were responsible for the vast majority of the security. $500 million or more went to the RCMP, which is the Canadian equivalent of the FBI, the National Police Force. And so where did all that money go? I mean, the RCMP were barely visible on the streets during the G20. So where did that $500 million go? Did this go into infrastructure in the future for future crowd control situations that we would expect to arise if these austerity measures get put into place and people are in soup lines or whatever else might arise? There's all these kinds of questions about how money was spent and who made decisions as to put G20 in Toronto and things of that nature that don't even start with the fundamental violations of people's rights. So that completely aside from all the inquiry that should go into how these rights were breached, whose decision it was, how is it justified, and what's going to be the precedent moving forward.
And you were saying that there really isn't at this point anything in place in terms of doing an inquiry or who would be doing it. I mean, do we have any idea how that would shake out, what that would look like, who exactly would be carrying this out, or is that just sort of a gray area at this point?
I'm not too familiar with how this process works, but as I understand it, the government itself, either the provincial government of Ontario, where Toronto's located, or the federal government, the government in power can name an inquiry and gets to name who controls it. And what is hoped is that it's political pressure that forces them to choose, a judge or somebody of enough character or integrity to actually look into where the facts lead. And this is really, as I said earlier, the only process that's offered to us in Canada that could in any way dream of rising to the incredible challenges and questions that lie in front of it.
Mm. And as far as individuals who were either, I guess I should say allegedly attacked or in some cases quite obviously from video footage attacked, or detained, put in a detention center, if they wanted to do something about this, what are their options other than can they just file a complaint, or what can they do? Yeah, so people have already started filing internal complaints with the various police services, that were involved, particularly with the Toronto Police Service. But also there's people filing court cases. Amy is actually part of one of these cases, along with 3 other journalists who were detained, who are filing a suit against the government, against the police service for their treatment. I'm also looking into my options, and really the goal of that is to hopefully get enough strength and be able to pass some sort of legal precedent that from our perspective as journalists in this particular instance, for me at least, speaking for myself, what I would like to set as a precedent is that journalists are giving every reasonable access to situations like this. That's not to say, necessarily, I could understand under the current legal framework that journalists wouldn't be allowed to interfere in police work, but certainly, asking journalists to leave the scene or be arrested, as happened on numerous occasions, or physically detaining them or physically beating them or, taking their equipment. And in many cases, journalists still have not gotten their equipment back, and there are some accusations that some footage and images have been deleted as well when they did get their equipment back. That we need to set a precedent that this, is a violation of the rights of the audience of those journalists to know what's going on. And it's kind of, it's amazing to me, and obviously we can't get inside of the heads of these police officers, but it's amazing to me that I guess they were either thinking they could get away with it or just not caring, but, to be attacking or going after journalists, clearly that's going to get some attention. You're going after the people who do the reporting. So, that's sort of a bit of an aside, I guess, but just it's hard to even wrap your head around how, the mentality that goes into that. Yeah, and it wasn't just, not that the independent journalists should expect this, because they shouldn't, but also some mainstream journalists were victims of this
treatment. For example, Farzad Fatolzadeh from CTV News, which is Canada's most watched news broadcaster. He's a producer. He was detained and put in a detention facility for 6 hours. There were a couple photographers from one of Canada's national newspaper, the National Post, who were detained, and so it was indiscriminate in terms of mainstream to independent. Although independent journalists certainly did bear the brunt of it, but I think that could be chalked up to the fact that it was independent journalists who often did not concede to police demands to leave the scene. They stayed on the scene to continue documenting, what appeared to them to be abuse of power, and they were punished for that.
Well, and I would imagine, obviously there are press badges, and I don't know exactly, what all was on that those press badges. I'm sure the affiliation was on there, but I'm sure in the melee of most of those situations, at least from what I've seen on video, they probably didn't, have that clear of an idea of who's independent, who's mainstream. They probably just knew journalists, and so. Yeah,
but in terms of,
it seems like it's probably just who was still around at the time.
Yeah, but in terms of how police operated and how they acted, this is not new in Canada in the sense of police acting this way. There's various communities in Canada that have been alleging and have been providing documentation that police act this way in their communities for years. Particularly Canada's Indigenous communities are often the victim of really horrible police misconduct that's been documented on numerous occasions, including murder of political leaders. And certainly some of the more marginalized urban communities in Canada, and right here in Toronto, I've certainly seen some of the similar things. For example, in just a little bit more than a month ago, there's an 18-year-old man named Junior Manon who was beaten to death. His family says by a police officer, and we've seen very little media investigation into that, nor taking seriously of these complaints both by his family and by his friends and other witnesses. And so that and he's just one of many youths from poor communities who's died with allegations that it happened at the hands of police officers. So, but what was really unprecedented here is that level of violence was spread out to communities that haven't really been the recipient of it before. For example, like the community of Parkdale in Toronto, which is it's a mix of working class and more upper middle class community in Toronto that saw a mass arrest take place there and saw people being searched and seized on the side of the road and things like that, and so there was and the independent journalist community and the mainstream journalist community and the pacifist activism community and all these different communities that were a lot of religious communities, for example, that were out doing they were arrested during a prayer vigil during the G20. This sort of police conduct, really touched on a series of communities that hadn't been, and I include myself in that hadn't directly been affected by it much in their lives previous to that. But one other thing I wanted to touch on with regards to this being a practice run. Now we don't have the smoking gun on that front, and that would hopefully be something that a public inquiry would look into as to the motivations for this sort of thing. But there were indications that a lot of points, it was all trials and testing and seeing what people would put up with and seeing how people would react. And especially when we include the fact that we know all of this was on video. For example, during the biggest mass arrest of the weekend, it was at the corner of Queen and Spadina, where hundreds of people were detained and many were arrested, picked out of the crowd, and they were detained for hours, and a couple of those hours in the pouring rain. And,
Well, Jesse, I hate to cut you short, but we only have 30 seconds. But I do want to thank you very much for being with us, and thank you to everyone who's listening, and check out the Real News Network. And again, thank you, Jesse.
Thank you.